Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 133rd episode of the Writ Podcast. Lots has changed over the last few weeks, and a lot more could change over the next few weeks now that Jagmeet Singh and the NDP has pulled out of its deal with Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. What will that mean for the fall sitting, and could we be going to the polls a lot sooner than we thought? And then, of course, on Monday, voters in two ridings will be going to the polls in LaSalle, Émard, Verdun, and in Elmwood, Transcona. And all four major parties will be put to the test there. So what should we look for in those by-elections? Joining me to break it all down is the pollster panel. Dan Arnold is Chief Strategy Officer at Pollara, worked as Director of Research and Advertising in the Prime Minister's office, and polled for the Trudeau Liberals in each of the past three elections. Andrew Enns is Executive Vice President at Léger, polled for the Federal Conservatives during the Harper years, and has polled for provincial Conservative parties across Canada. And James Valkey is Director of Research and Strategy at Viewpoints Research and has worked on many central campaigns for the New Democrats. Hello to all of you. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks, Eric.
Good. Great to be back.
Hope you all had a nice summer. It's going to be quite a fall. Why don't we talk first about what's changed over the last 2 weeks? The surprise announcement, surprise to some maybe, that Jagmeet Singh, the New Democrats, are pulling out of the supply and confidence agreement with the Liberals. James, I'm going to put you on the spot right away. Why did this happen?
Why did it happen? The progress of time, events, changes in sentiment. I'm not sure. What I'll say is what I perceived from the New Democrats' stance, and more than just the words they said, but the structure of how they did it. They telegraphed this through a video they released, and they followed up with questions the next day. And by they, I mean one person. That was Jagmeet. I think that they made a big thing of this. They wanted to show a lot of attention, and they got that. And they wanted to lead with their leader. This was a kind of all or nothing. This was a change in direction, a change in stance, a change in focus. Their messaging said that, regardless of the specific words and the rationale they provided, they keyed on that the Liberal Party is weak. They wanted to make sure they knew that. And the other point is they were standing up to Pierre Poilievre's cuts. Those are two things that rang really true throughout all their messaging. I think this is a big thing that the agreement has fallen apart. The rationalization as to how they got here, why they got here, I don't think that matters so much to Canadians who look forward to what's happening next. And I think the tables have changed a little bit and the players on the field have moved around. And I think that's the big signal from this. And they're leading with Jagmeet, and they're leading strong. And he referenced successful New Democratic leaders from the past in campaigns in some of the videos. And I think that they're putting themselves on the war footing of an election campaign. And I think that was the message that got out from it.
Dan, for the Liberals, from their perspective, was the supply and confidence agreement, was that a net positive or net negative, not just in terms of keeping the government alive, but in terms of how the public was seeing the government?
Yeah, I mean, look, from a stress level for people working in government, I'm sure a net positive, not to have to be worried about what's going on in committees and confidence votes to the same level that they're going to have to be over the next year. I think from a public perception, I don't think it really hurt them. I mean, even Andrew had a poll this summer I saw that was asking NDP voters if they thought the agreement had been a net positive or not negative. And among NDP voters, I think 60% said net positive, 11% said net negative. More mixed overall with the broader public, but Liberal voters seemed pretty positive towards it. So, I think it's been generally good for the Liberals. They're going to have to be a little bit more attentive to votes in the House of Commons and case by case non-confidence votes and things like that this fall. I don't know about the NDP rationale on this because if their concern was that they were too close to the Liberals, there's going to be a lot more media scrutiny on every vote that comes up now for the fall. And if the NDP does have to back the Liberals a few times, which they probably will, for the casual voter, they're going to hear a lot more about Jagmeet Singh propping up Justin Trudeau than I think they did even last year. So, I don't know how that's going to play out for the NDP. Certainly going to raise the stress level for the Liberals, and for the Conservatives, they can just kind of get a bowl of popcorn and lob non-confidence votes across the House of Commons and just watch everybody else sort of scurry and panic from the sidelines.
Dan, just to stick with you for a second, if the Liberals have to go to the Bloc for some support to pass some stuff, if the NDP decides not to vote with the government, is there risk there for the Liberals?
I don't think it's as big a taboo as it was back in. I remember the Dion confidence crisis after 2008. There was certainly a lot of public backlash to the idea of the Bloc being part of the coalition, but I think that was more just because the Liberals had clearly lost the election. This is a case where Trudeau's got a pretty sizable mandate, and as long as they're not giving concessions that are seen as being un-Canadian or seen as being a betrayal of their values or what they ran on, I think it'd be fine on a case-by-case basis to bring in the Bloc in a few situations.
Yeah, some of the things the Bloc is talking about do seem to be less kind of Quebec nationalist when it has to do with the supports for senior citizens and stuff like that. So we'll see what goes from there. Andrew, for the Conservatives, does this change anything? Does it make it more difficult for them to go after Singh? Does this matter from a Conservative perspective?
I don't think it really matters in terms of a significant shift in strategy. I think, as Dan said, that they'll likely look for opportunities to raise confidence issues in the House. I think they need to be careful and thoughtful to some degree with respect to with a more dynamic House like this, and there's no certainty now around the government staying in power. I mean, the government can position things in a way that could actually put the Conservatives in somewhat delicate situation. I mean, confidence votes around something that's a very popular move, for example. Are you just defeating the government just because you can, or are you thwarting the will of progress on maybe a thorny issue or something like that? I mean, I go back to sort of Stephen Harper's two minority governments. I mean, he never had any deals to keep that minority government in power, but he managed to do so for collectively 4 years, and he did so by in some respects strategically keeping the opposition parties a little bit off balance because of different issues in different parts of the country, different times it appealed to different parties. So, I mean, I think the Liberals will see. I mean, it's a bit of a different dynamic, but they have that ability, and so the Conservatives have to be aware. But I think largely, they will look for they will continue to press their opportunities. I think when it comes to the Bloc, I think Dan's right. I don't think the temperature is the same as it was in 2008, but there will be some opportunity there may be some opportunities for the Conservatives to message around that. And I think in, certainly parts of the country, say British Columbia, for example, that, or rile up the base in Alberta potentially, those sorts of things. But I think it's probably, given the time frame we've got to deal with and the situation being different case by case, it probably doesn't become much of a factor.
All right, then let's talk about the timeline. First of all, anybody think there's an election this year? Anybody want to put their hands up?
Oh, I think
No.
there's a chance. I
Okay.
mean, you've got conversations around prorogation. I mean, I don't know how real those are, but that presents sort of like, why would you do that? What's going on? I mean, if you do that, you're now immediately presenting a confidence opportunity very early, this year, and on an issue of this is my vision for government. Well, you've just pulled the pin on your government, and potentially you might even pull the pin on your leader. So I think the uncertainty is still there for sure.
James, yeah, go ahead, James.
There are factors of chaos that come with the agreement not happening. A lot of them have been identified. Prorogation, committees. Committees can, like, if you look at the issues that are on our horizon, there is the Russian RT investment in Canadian media. That could blow up at committee. Not in favor of some of the opposition parties. There are issues that the New Democrats could support Conservatives. Poilievre has said he is going to bring a confidence motion at the earliest possible convenience. I mean, this is like getting half of your wish coming true for Pierre Poilievre. The agreement has fallen apart, but he's not getting the election he wants. And he has been a whistling kettle in his rhetoric for the last year and a half. And now is the time for nuance. And if he can, if he keeps being a whistling kettle, he looks like he's thirsty for an election campaign for the sake of an election campaign. So there's a lot of adjustment every party's going to have to do in this fall session. But we've seen it before with Harper, as was mentioned, and with Martin before. And I mean, every party's going to have to be really tight on their communications and their strategy. But as Andrew said, like, anything can kind of happen. So we'll see.
Well, James, what will the NDP do if they are put up against the wall with a confidence vote? We know the Conservatives would go to a campaign yesterday if they could. The Bloc seems to be able to go to a campaign. I don't think they're afraid of one. They don't seem all that enthusiastic at the same time. But the NDP, can they defeat the government?
I think that they can. I mean, I think that, so a couple things. They have, you look at their, like I mentioned, their positioning is election forward stance. Like, they are signaling to their troops to get ready. We are in election readiness mode. We are facing that direction. But I think that there will be, not dissimilar to under the Martin years and under the Harper years, if New Democrats are at the crux of making an agreement to move the government forward, they are going to, A, champion the hell out of whatever concessions they make, and B, ensure those concessions get into people's pocketbooks like right away. It can't be like, we're keeping them in confidence, so in 5 years the Liberals will do this. That's off the table. These have to be immediate concessions right now. We saw that under Jack Layton with housing investments, with the corporate tax rate, with student loan forgiveness, and they did a good job championing those things at the time to look at as though they had agency in this agreement. And I think the issue with the CASA or the SACA, whatever it is the agency and the amount of things they could get out of the agreement kind of went stale. So now they're going on I presume on a case-by-case basis. And that will, again, put them back in the headlines, which I think they need to do, and bring some agency to what they're doing.
Dan, for the Liberals, do they just kind of go through this week by week, trying to survive? How far would they be willing to go to try to survive? We all assume they don't want to go to an election campaign, but is there a point where they would as well put in a poison pill, not allow themselves to be defeated? How do the Liberals navigate the next few months?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the Liberals and NDP and Bloc are all playing poker with pretty bad hands. So, people will bluff, and ultimately, though, everyone will have a point when they have to fold. I think Liberals will have to think about survival more than they have before. And the thing is, though, like, if you're doing things that are popular, that's what should get votes on the other side as well, too. So I think as much as they can, these deals, they can find a way to cut deals and do things that should be, relatively popular for their base, and get the Bloc or the NDP to sign on as well too. So, I think it's going to require a bit more forethought on that front. But I don't know if they'll necessarily need to completely change course. They've already been, largely aligned, I think, with the Bloc and the NDP on most issues. So, it'll be more just sort of navigating any, things that I guess are outside of the policy sphere. As mentioned, around foreign interference and just kind of feisty confidence votes by Poilievre, but I don't think they'll have to change course too dramatically.
The Liberals don't have as much to worry about on the provincial scene. They do have a party in New Brunswick that could be on track for a government if they win in October. Andrew, does that come into play at all? Like, would the Conservatives be concerned that they could split the resources for Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick and John Rustad in BC, places where, in Saskatchewan, they're almost certainly going to win, but they might not want to make things more complicated for some of their provincial cousins?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric, and it probably should be a bit of a consideration. Will it be a consideration? I'm not sure. I mean, I kind of like James's whistling kettle analogy, and I don't think the heat's turning off that. I mean, if the opportunity presents for an election, I think there'll be an election. So I don't think he's holding back the timing of confident votes to get through, by the mid-October stage or anything. I think he'll, it will be business as usual. And I mean, I think really where there's probably overlap is, you touched on it, New Brunswick. I suspect there's lots of federal provincial overlap in resources. You know, there's some in Saskatchewan, but maybe less so. I'm not so sure in British Columbia, to be honest. I mean, that Rusted party is growing like wildfire, and I'm not 100% sure if there's really sort of any sort of concrete sort of crossovers there. So that one I don't think factors in really at all.
James, does it factor in for the NDP and Jagmeet Singh? Does he take that into consideration?
I'm not really sure. I know some of the parties who have larger provincial establishments are their own operation, and they don't necessarily factor in resources from the federal. And some of those bigger provinces have definitely their own operations that they don't need to consider that. But as far as the federal NDP is concerned, I'm really not sure if that's where resources would get shared or where they would cross over. I'm not sure if that's been considered or what impact it would have. I from past experience, I know the Saskatchewan NDP and BC NDP have robust resource allocations and planning that is internal to their processes. They may call on expertise from outside of the regions, but they have a long tradition of building their own structural resources.
Certainly with the Saskatchewan NDP, I mean they're occasionally tripping over themselves to sort of show the difference between the federal NDP in terms of policies and all the other stuff. So I think that one you're probably pretty safe on. I'm less certain about EB for sure, but
I want to move on to the by-elections, but just before that, Dan, I wanted to hear you on just a few changes within the Liberal Party. Jeremy Broadhurst, the National Campaign Director, in there for about a year, deciding to step aside. I know you've worked with him before, right? Mark Carney coming in as a advisor of some kind on economic issues. Possibility of Pablo Rodriguez skipping town to go run for the Quebec Liberals. What does all this mean for the Liberals internally?
Well, I mean, if people want change, I guess there's some change there that's happening, either by design or accident. I think in all these cases, at least when it's people that are leaving, it's always puts organizational strain. Jeremy is very competent and very respected, and that's a big role to fill at this stage in the game. I think there's other people who can do it, but unclear if those people will have that same level of respect around the organization. So there's a bit of that that's going to have to get thought through on that front. And same thing with Pablo. I mean, it's somebody who, if he leaves, big shoes to fill on that front as well too. And these things take time. And if you're already juggling confidence votes and you're juggling staffing issues, and it becomes a lot for the people who are working around PMO to air traffic control, I guess, at the same time for all that's going on.
Let's move on to the by-elections now. And before we get into the actual races, Dan, since I think you were the most closest to working within one of those shops, what kind of resources in terms of data does a party have in a by-election like in LaSalle, Émard, Verdun, Elmwood, Transcona? What would the Liberals and the Conservatives, the NDP, what would they be working with right now?
Yeah, the thing about a by-election is you've got a lot more available as a central party when it comes to resourcing, because that's the show and that's what everyone's paying attention to. So, I imagine most of the senior people within government are seeing daily reports in terms of ID rates, door knock rates, even down to which times of the day are better or worse when it comes to that. So they're getting a lot of that on the ground intel. From a polling perspective, you're probably not getting much more than a general election. Maybe you would do one poll at some point in the campaign, but it's hard to do really credible riding surveys. So, I think the data that they're going to be swimming in primarily is going to be coming from the doors directly. And because you've got all of the Liberal volunteers from Montreal and probably some from Ottawa blanketing the riding, they're going to be having a lot of data coming in from the canvas.
Okay. Andrew, since you're the closest, I think, to an actual by-election out in Winnipeg, why don't we start with Elmwood, Transcona? What's your read on the situation there?
And I think James kind of alluded to it at the very beginning of our conversation. I think turnout's going to be pretty low. I mean, both these by-elections being fought in the dog days of summer. I think Montreal's no different than Winnipeg. It's people got a lot of other things on their mind, and it's hard getting hold of people. As Dan said, I mean, any intel you're getting is likely coming from people you're reaching on the doors, and that's hard to do. It's it's a tough riding. It's a kind of a working class riding, and so it's not the easiest getting hold of people. But my take is that I think this is still very much the NDP's to lose. I think that it will be closer. They won it in 19 and 21 by 20 plus points. I think that the margin will be much tighter. The Conservatives will put a stronger show, but I do think that ultimately, with low voter turnout, it comes down to who's got the best ground game. I think the historic tradition of that riding being NDP, once in my lifetime, that it's not been NDP in 2011. So I think they've got the edge there. I think they've got the benefit of some coattails provincially with a very popular provincial premier, NDP premier in government. I haven't seen a lot of provincial involvement in terms of cabinet ministers, but I have seen a few. I've seen an MLA, a couple of MLAs, and Daniel was I saw him in some media coverage in the riding. So I'm sure there's some, and there's certainly more behind the scenes. There's lists. The two provincial ridings that largely make up that federal riding both went solidly NDP provincially. So I'm sure there's data there. Now, that said, Conservatives will make this close, much closer, because the last time they won it in 2011, they polled 40% nationally. They're polling 40% plus now for almost a year. So there's vote there. But I think the challenge for the Conservatives will be finding it. I think that's where it's going to come. Now, if they can muster a good ground game and find that vote and get it out, they can make it quite close. But I mean, even at high water mark for Conservatives in the country, I think they won that riding by less than 2 points. I think it was 2.5%, maybe 2%. Like, it's very narrow. So, like, it's Conservatives. Like, for the challenge for the Conservatives is there's no database really of Conservative voters in that riding. I mean, they materialize when they get angry at something and they get tied up on issues, and then you just got to find them. And that's a little harder to do than knowing your voters in advance.
James, what's at stake here for the NDP in this riding?
Well, a by-election loss is at stake, and to be on Andrew's point, it's not unusual, but it's been for the last 30 years. It's been a New Democrat quote unquote stronghold. But in 2011, when the federal NDP got their best showing in their history of existence in Canada, that is the year they lost it to the Conservatives, right? So there's a consistent. Saying it's an NDP stronghold doesn't tell the story of how closely of a blue-orange riding this actually is. The Conservatives are consistently in second. The Liberals are consistently in a distant third. I don't see that changing. And even when the New Democrats lost it in 2011, they lost by 300 votes, right? Like, there's other dynamics at play, and I think the Conservatives' national polling numbers will have an impact. But again, I'm strongly agreeing with everything Andrew is saying, and reiterating the fact that turnout and getting out your vote could give either of the campaigns the edge. And I think for New Democrats, that 30-year history of the neighborhoods, knowing the people, and hopefully being able to pull them out to the vote could give them the advantage. It's going to be a close one.
Okay. Dan, Liberals probably not going to be anywhere close to competitive. They haven't been in this part of the city for decades at least. So curious to just hear your thoughts on the riding, but also if the Liberals are looking at this riding to kind of parse through some of the results, what they might be looking for.
I think really they're not putting a lot into it. It's probably the sort of thing where they have a bit of liberty to run experiments and try a few things out and see what works, but it's not one that they'd be even remotely in the game in. I agree. It's going to be a pretty close one. It seems like, from all indication, as Andrew says, Manitoba seems to have a lot of provincial bleed through historically. I remember in 2015 when I was looking at the polling numbers federally for Trudeau. Manitoba was really the first province where the NDP vote moved to the Liberals because everyone hated Greg Selinger at the time. And this Elmwood Transcona was very close to that election, whereas 2021 people were pissed at Pollster, and the NDP won it by 20 plus points. So yeah, I think probably the canoe coattails still help the NDP there when all's said and done. But yeah, it'll be an interesting one for sure.
Okay, if we move on to LaSalle, Émard, Verdun, Dan, sticking with you. For the Liberals, does this one matter more or less than Toronto St. Paul's?
I mean, they're both ones that people will be paying attention to. I think at the end of the day, neither of them really matter because we already have a lot of data points on the table that show us that the Liberals are not doing well, and this will just be one or two more. But they matter in the sense of media hype and speculation, and MPs getting antsy and therefore going on the record when they talk to journalists as opposed to just griping on background and things like that. So, I think it's getting hyped up. Maybe not quite as much as St. Paul's, but there's certainly a lot of attention around it. It's an interesting one to watch. There actually haven't been a lot of true three-way races in by-elections in Canada in our history. I pulled up my by-election spreadsheet, which I'm sure we all have on our own computers, and I was looking back over the last 20 years, and there hasn't been a single by-election where the three top parties have been within 10 percentage points. If you're looking for some trivia on election night, Eric, when you're trying to kill 6 hours while the votes are being counted, with Philippe there, the closest thing to a three-way race we've seen in a by-election in Canada over the last 20 years was actually Calgary Centre in 2012, which was an 11-point spread because of a weird green surge that happened in that campaign. And maybe this one won't be close. Maybe somebody will take it going away because of other, local candidate factors or organization. But it certainly looks like it's going to be a pretty close three-way race, and therefore, a lot of unpredictability and a lot of, if you're a voter in that riding, you're probably getting your phone dialed, 6 times a day at this stage.
Yeah, just wonder how many of the people there have figured out what those phone calls are about yet. James, for the NDP, they have a candidate with some local renown. Seems to be a pretty strong campaign. Whether or not they'll be able to win it or not, the Bloc is also a pretty significant player in that riding. What's the NDP going to take out of these results, particularly if they win it?
Well, they'll do a victory lap. They'll be very happy. It's interesting, I think for the parties, these elections are very important, but for the leaders, these elections may be far more important, Eric. You asked about what it means to the Liberals. My question is what it means for Trudeau if he doesn't win this one, right? They set a bar on Toronto St. Paul and failed and said, okay, the next one's Montreal. And I think we'll see what unfolds if the Liberals don't seem to be successful in this. For New Democrats, I think that they would be very delighted. I think for Jagmeet, I think he'll be very happy. I think they'll use it as a reinforcement that their narrative is going in the right direction and they're working really hard. Craig Sauvé is a well-known municipal politician, been elected a few times and has a real roots in the riding, and it'll be a big upset if the Orange team wins it. And I think that they'll learn a lot out of they put resources in it, no doubt. They're going for it. They want it. And I think there'll be a lot of lessons learned for them going forward. And I think that could have big implications for the upcoming federal election. Like by-elections are an opportunity to road test new staff, sharpen experiences with the risk of the government falling not at play. So it's a really good crucible for that sort of, not experimentation, but that kind of like taking it out on the water and see what it can really do. And I think New Democrats are experiencing that right now. We'll see if they win. I think they're going to be, you'll probably hear it from them for quite a while.
James, just for a second, I'm sure the NDP is excited. They haven't been involved really in a by-election for a while, and now they're involved in two. They're the only party that's really in contention in both of them. But you said, Trudeau's leadership could be in trouble if there was a defeat here. What about Singh if they lose both of these?
Yeah, that's unclear. I think, what do I want to say? I think the party, like I'd mentioned before, with the breaking up the caste agreement, I think they're already projecting that they're ready for a federal election. And I think I don't think that position is going to change regardless of the outcome of these by-elections. I think that they are focused on their messaging, that the Liberals are weak, that they're going to oppose Poilievre's cuts, and we are the only vessel to oppose Poilievre. I think that that's not going to change regardless of the outcome of the elections.
Andrew, the Conservatives were even lower here than the Liberals were in Elmwood, Transcona. They had 7.5% of the vote, so they're really not in it. So, what are you going to be looking for these out of this riding?
Use Dan's popcorn analogy. I think that's what the Conservatives are doing in Verdun. I mean, they're sitting back. It is a three-way race. It's an interesting one, as Dan says. Not often they pop up. I do find it when the CASA agreement was torn up and we saw sort of the outcome over the next few days. I thought CASA tearing it up probably helped the NDP a bit in Elmwood. Probably allowed them to pivot a bit easier on the doorsteps on some of what they're hearing in Elmwood, and I think they may benefit. I wonder whether or not it might actually hurt them a bit in Verdun, because it's given some air to the Bloc in terms of they were very quick, thought very, very clever in terms of stepping up and just saying Blanchette did a good job, English and French, in terms of saying, hey, we're here, we're going to do our part. And I suspect for some voters in Verdun who were leaning Bloc, that actually might be kind of an attraction. So it'll be interesting to see. I think that from the Conservative perspective, a Liberal loss in Verdun and an NDP loss in Elmwood would probably be the best scenario, because I think you'd find both leaders. To James's point, I mean, I think Singh's already started marking out the territory, but there'll still nonetheless be some. There'll be griping, I think, within caucus, because there's a lot of seats like Elmwood around Hamilton.
There's always griping in caucus.
There's always
Andrew.
griping.
There's
Might
always
be griping outside of caucus, maybe, but. So I think that'll be interesting for them, but it'll be good to get these done and get into the Parliament and go from there.
Well, there'll certainly be some metaphors we can draw from a battle in Verdun. If win or lose, we'll see what happens.
It's going to be an exciting fall, regardless. Yeah. Next month is going to be something.
The next couple months with the provincial elections. Okay, so then we'll just finish on this and hear from all three of you. You can choose something federal, provincial, not U.S. We all know the U.S. election is going to be the big wild card. That's not any brilliant insight. But what you're going to be looking for the fall months, the kind of question that you think the next couple months will answer. James, why don't you go first?
Sure, and you gave us this question in advance, and I put some thought to it, and I think that my biggest. So I'm going to start with something controversial. I really dislike the horse race polling game. It's fun and exciting for observers, but for clients and people who are using research to help them make decisions, using horse race polling to inform your strategic plan is like using your rearview mirror to tell you which way you're going to drive your car. What you want to do is look into the crosstabs, look into the qualitative to see what's coming on the horizon. Now that's a bit of a long-winded thing to say, is that what I'm looking for is a potential change in public sentiment this fall. We have seen news stories about rent prices going down in college towns. The Bank of Canada has reduced interest rates. The first is good for renters. The second is good for homeowners. Inflation has cooled. That's good for anybody who buys groceries. Gas prices are down from where they were a year ago. And to connect this to what I'd said before, that tea kettle whistling of Poilievre may start to disalign with people who are feeling some of the pressures over the last 3 years easing. Public sentiment has been a roller coaster for the last 5 years. Anybody in research knows that. It's been an absolute nightmare to predict where it's going to go next. The outrage may subside, and people may be less, the boiling kettle angry at things. If that changes, certainly the dynamics of public opinion and what they're looking for from their leaders, their sentiments towards incumbency might change as well too. So for me, I'm looking to see if some of these real big things, not mostly apolitical, that impact people's lives on a daily basis, the mortgage renewals, the rent renegotiations, the grocery prices stabilizing, if that's starting to have a cooling response impact on public sentiment. And if that's the case, parties may have to change some of their narratives to adjust to that and see what that works out to. So I know that's not like I want to see what's going to happen in Saskatchewan, but public sentiment is one of the biggest factors that can help clients and parties plan the next 6 months. And if you start looking ahead of what's going to come in the next 6 months, it is chaos and unpredictable. And I think that's what I'll be looking for this fall, a change in that public sentiment, even for or against incumbents and the economy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And those provincial campaigns might show us a little bit what if there is something happening, if it has an impact on the results.
They very well could.
Andrew, why don't you go next?
Well, first of all, as a perpetrator of horse race polls on a regular basis, I take great offense to that. And hopefully the host of this program, whose basically livelihood is based on polls, will...
The only thing worse than horse race polls are those people who blog about horse race polls and have Substack to talk about horse race polls all the time.
Yeah, but... on a more serious note, I mean, I'm 100% James on the sentiment thing. Although I will say and I don't do as much qual work as I used to, but I was roped into some in the latter part of August, and I have to say, and I'm sure you would agree, I mean, it hasn't changed yet in terms of the struggles and the angst and the concerns of the public, and I think that's, it's a wise thing you said that it will change at some point, and parties who are doing their homework will detect that and adjust accordingly. But I just from the stuff that I was involved in, we're a ways away yet. There's still a lot of angst and anger out there. I think BC, I'm looking at BC. I think it's going to be a fascinating race provincially. And I think, quite frankly, the outcome and how that plays out and how the issues play out in British Columbia actually will have a bearing federally. Like, lots of times provincial's provincial, federal's federal. But I actually think Poilievre has inserted himself into provincial politics in British Columbia to a degree. He's confronted EB on some issues that he's leveraged well federally, but he's also, I think, impacted what happened in British Columbia in terms of the Conservative Party and the merger with we call it a merger, takeover of the BC United,
hostile takeover, yeah. And
so I think the outcome there has will have implications, and not necessarily. I mean, I don't know. Rusted wins. I think one would say, "Oh, cartwheels for the Poilievre crowd." That I'm not sure. I'm not sure 100% that that's even the case. So I do think there's really some interesting fallout from that election, regardless of the result, and it'll be quite close. And James, just for the record, we will be producing horse race polls on a fairly regular basis during that campaign.
Thank you. Appreciated.
I just don't like it as a tool for strategic planning. That's the part. That's the part that, yeah.
All right. Yeah. Keep it coming, guys. Keep it coming. All right. Dan, how about you? What are you going to be looking for this fall?
So I'm really interested in the three provincial elections because they're all going on basically at the same time. Election days within 10 days of each other for the three of them. They all are competitive, and we can parse kind of like who's the favorite everywhere. But within the last month, there's been literally a poll that has showed a dead heat in each of those three provinces, and a lot can happen in the campaign. So you've got three competitive elections, and what I look for then is, does the change sentiment that we have seen at the federal level and in other countries around the world over the last year, does that start to bleed a bit more into the provincial scene? I think I've thrown this stat out before on the podcast here, but between late 2019 to early 2023, we had a full election cycle in Canada. 9 of 10 incumbent governments got reelected, other than Nova Scotia. Incumbents went everywhere. Yeah. And then last fall, Wab Kinew wins in Manitoba. Maybe that's just a one-off, like local dynamics. Could be something weird, who knows? But now we've got three more case studies coming up here, and I think at that point we'll have a pretty good litmus test of how people are feeling about incumbents. And like maybe the New Brunswick Liberals win, and that's just a one-off again because they've got a strong leader, and even Blaine Higgs' own cabinet doesn't seem like they're going to vote for him on election day. And you could say that's a bit of a weird one, but you look at BC, and like David Eby looked invincible up until a couple of months ago, and part of that was the vote split, but he was also very popular, and that's gone down. The SAS party has looked invincible for, can we say, decades at this point? I think we're getting there. And if one of those governments falls, I think that starts to tell you a bit about the change sentiment. Legault is obviously another guy who looked invincible, who has fallen from grace. And if we start seeing dominoes like this falling elsewhere, I would think even that premiers who are polling pretty well right now, like Ford in Houston and I guess King, whenever we get a PI poll on those rare magical days, they'd have to start getting a little bit worried too, because the cliff comes very quickly when public opinion turns against you, and we've seen it to turn against a lot of governments very quickly. And is that sentiment spreading across the land? I think we'll get a good sense of that this fall.
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting political season, probably the most since the last election, and who knows, maybe it'll also have an election. So we'll have lots to chat about the next time we all gather, and I'm looking forward to that. And thanks to the three of you for joining me today.
Great to meet again.